Hello and welcome to this installment in the Interdisciplinary Research Seminar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Ghassan Moazin and I'm an assistant professor at the Institute and the convener of this talk series. So today we're very glad and honored to welcome to the Interdisciplinary Research Seminar Professor Guido Alfani. Professor Alfani is Professor of Economic History at the Bocconi University in Milan in Italy. He has published widely on the economic history of Italy, Europe, and the West in general. And he most recently published, his newest book is called As Gods Among Men, A History of the Rich in the West, which was published to much acclaim by Princeton University Press at the end of last year. And so we're particularly grateful that he has agreed to talk to us about this book today. I've been looking forward to this talk for quite some time. Before I hand things over to Professor Alfani, just a few housekeeping notes. As usual, the presentation will go on for 30-35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions for Professor Alfani, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom. And I will then read them out for Professor Alfani, and he can then get back to you. Without any further ado, Professor Alfani, if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
Thank you very much, Ghassan, for this introduction, and thank you very much for having you here. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity of presenting you this book. I'm expected not to speak too much, so let me jump straight into how the book is structured. It's divided into three parts. The first has to do with the definition of who the rich were, what wealth is, and also it provides an overlook, provides a survey of some metrics we have, for example, how rich were the rich in history in terms of their wealth share. And I will tell you something about this part. The second part, which is a pretty large part in the book, I will tell you very little about it for reasons of time, and that's about the main paths to affluence or to wealth that we can find across history. And then I will focus a little bit more on the third and final part, which has to do with the role played by the rich in Western societies. And when I will introduce that, I will also tell you why this book is about Western societies specifically. Now, looking at, again, what we know in terms of the relative position of the rich in society, after some decades of research, and I also was heavily involved in this research, thanks to my previous projects, we now have some estimates of the wealth shares of the top 5%, or in general of whatever percentile we want to look at, for the pre-industrial period from circa 1300 to 1800. When we are very lucky, then we can go back to just before the Black Death in the 14th century, which, as we know, killed about half the people of Europe and of the broader Mediterranean area. And as you can see in this graph, the point is in these 5 centuries, in the pre-industrial period that we can cover, the Black Death seems to have triggered the only phase of inequality decline. And after that, from the middle of the 15th century, we have pretty much everywhere, with one exception, which is Germany, we have growth in the wealth share of the rich, or the top 5%. So basically, the rich are becoming richer in terms of their ability to control a larger and larger share of total wealth. I don't only look at the 5%, I also look at the 1%. So I take the top 5% and top 1% as two possible and combining definitions of the rich. And sometimes I also have to look, or I decide to look at even smaller percentiles. Now, just one quick thing about Germany. The reason why Germany is different, the German area, because Germany was not unified before 1871 actually, is that in the 17th century, in the first half of the 17th century, there is another phase of inequality reduction, which seems to have been triggered by the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which were the most destructive conflict of pre-industrial Europe. Plus, the worst plague epidemic affecting Germany after the Black Death in the 1620s. So these catastrophes together lead to a second phase of deconcentration of wealth, only in Germany, as far as we know, and then from the late 17th century, the tendency becomes growing again. Now, if we move into the modern period, so the 19th and 20th century, we see that this tendency for the concentration of wealth in few hands continues. Here you have the wealth share of the 1%ers, right? And you see that their share increases up until the beginning of World War I and then starts declining. This period, which begins in World War I and then continues till the early 1970s, is often called the great compression of inequality. It also involves income inequality, by the way. In the first phase, it is again connected to the world wars.
Professor Alfani,
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting. It seems like there's a problem with the PowerPoint. Would you
Right.
mind
So
maybe sharing it
the
again?
slides don't move.
No, they don't seem to move. Yeah, we're still at on the very first slide. Yeah.
Okay, let me start. Let me stopping the sharing and then I will try again. I have no idea why this is happening. Can you see it now?
No, I only see a black screen, I'm afraid. Yes, now I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, now you see it. But I am getting an error message from Zoom. So can you hear me?
I hear you fine, yes.
Sorry, Zoom crashed. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you, but we don't have
The presentation.
screen. Yeah, the presentation.
So let's see. Okay, you have it now?
Yes, now I can see it.
So maybe it's better if I show the slides in, well, let's check this. Now, do you see that it's full screen?
No, I still see the normal PowerPoint.
Okay. But maybe it's better because otherwise we are getting into trouble, okay? So I don't know why,
Might
this
be,
is not
yeah.
the first time this happens. So I will not show the full screen because otherwise we risk having Zoom crashing as it just happened.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah, I think that might be better. Yeah.
Right, but right now the slide is different. You see the right, you see the slide number whatever, number 5, with the world wars and development
No,
of
I still see I still see the first slide actually.
This is bizarre. Now, what do you see now?
I still see the first slide with
Okay.
the book title, book cover. That's strange.
Yeah. Okay, let's try this. What do you see now?
At the moment, a black screen.
So Zoom is crashing again. Will be unconnected, I think, for a few seconds. What is that? Okay. Sorry, I don't know why this is happening.
No problem. No, we'll get it to work.
Here I am again. I'm very sorry. This
Yeah.
is not an issue with the internet connection. It's some sort of problem with Zoom, which I don't know why is happening. What can we do is I continue to talk and maybe I could send you the slides
Yeah,
and you try sharing them, okay?
sure, I can do that. Yes.
So I'll do this now and then I will resume my speech. Okay. I just send them. Anyway, so when you are ready, share them, and I will continue. So when hopefully I'll be able to show you the graph about the 19th and 20th century, and you haven't seen the graph on the pre-industrial period, but that's not a problem because I will show you a survey graph after. You will see that again there are these 40 years of reduction in the wealth share of the richest, beginning with World War I. The first phase is connected to the war wars and then to the destruction of financial capital, especially after World War I, due to war hyperinflation, to the destruction of physical capital caused by World War II. And then for 20 years in Western countries, there is a continued reduction of wealth inequality, which is usually associated with the development of the Western welfare state systems. And in fact, that story is also beginning in the previous period, which is when we have across the West the development of relatively intense and highly progressive taxation of pretty much everything, wealth, income, and inheritances. Did you get the slides, Gassam?
No, I have not received them yet.
Right, because it's a big file, so maybe that's the problem. I will send them to you as a link, okay?
Okay.
Anyway, so after the yeah, let's see if you get it now. After the end of the 1970s, however, there is an inversion of the tendency, and the wealth share of the richest continues to grow again. And this is the story across Western countries from the early 1980s until today. So this is also why there is a worry about growing inequalities in wealth, but not only across the West. Now, the problem with defining the rich as those belonging to the, say, 1% or top 5% is basically that if we do it, we are fixing the rich as a, as a fixed percentage of the total population, while in fact we would like to know whether their prevalence, so their share of population, changes. And for studying this, I also look at another definition, which is relative. So I look at those who have wealth at least 10 times above the median. Did you get the presentation, Gassam?
I have, yes.
Fantastic.
Let me just share it.
I'm very sorry for this, but we were
no problem, no problem. It happens. It
trying
happens.
before, it seems to work.
Can you see it now?
Yep. Yes. So please go to, please cycle to go to the next one. So this is the pre-industrial period, the wealth share to 5%. Okay, go on.
You want me to be here or?
No, go next one. And
yes.
the next one, and then you move to the 1 foot. Yeah, next one. Next, okay, this one. So this is the survey graph, right? This is the general picture we get. A long phase of growth in the wealth share of the richest, so the wealth gets concentrated in fewer and fewer hands in the last 7 centuries or so, for all the areas we can more or less look at. Of course, for Europe, we have more information from the pre-industrial period, but if we really want to focus on the longest time series, this is basically that they refer to Italy, meaning different parts of different Italian purification states in the United Kingdom. And you see that there are these 2 phases of deconcentration, one triggered by the Black Death in the 14th century, and the other one beginning with World War I. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is what we get if we instead look at the at those who are 10 times above the median. So what this graph tells you, if you also consider that in the early modern period, the wealth share of the richest was also growing, is that at the same time, the wealthy were becoming richer compared to the rest of society, so with a larger share of wealth, and more abundant, because in this case, the prevalence can vary. Now, I'm sorry that this part of the presentation has been a little bit complicated because of the technical issues, but let's move to the second part, which are the paths to affluence. So Gassan, please check. Okay, fantastic. Now, these are the three main paths to affluence which I focus on, because I think that they're very important, and also because they allow us to touch on some very important topic. Of course, the path of the nobility, with nobility and aristocracy, which was very important in the Middle Ages as a way to become wealthy, but also allows to explore one specific problem, which is that of inherited wealth, right? Which in Western societies today is usually considered to be kind of less legitimate compared to wealth made. So if one can claim that he made his wealth, this is considered to be kind of proper compared to simply having inherited it. The other issue we have with nobility is that if we expand the concept to aristocracy more generally, and in sociologist Max Weber's definition, aristocracy doesn't require a formal nobility, right? It's simply having a sort of privilege. And the point is, if we do this, we can also look in this way at the establishment of wealth dynasties, which we observe throughout history. And often when we have phases during which it seems to have been relatively easy to become wealthy, we also see that new wealth, so the wealth accumulated by new people who were not wealthy before, tends to become old by the process of inheritance, and when you move from the generation of the founders to other subsequent generations. And in these groups, we also see that aristocratic features develop. And then the problem becomes whether, in order to protect their privilege, and because you have to protect it, otherwise a privilege shared too widely is no privilege at all, in order to do it, then they try and actually and keep down and push down new people, right? And this is arguably what happens, for example, in the United States towards the end of the Gilded Age, so at the turn of the 20th century. Now, we today tend to consider that another path to affluence is the most legitimate, which is that of entrepreneurship and innovation. The idea is, okay, if you are able to exploit some new opportunity arising because, for example, of technological change, think about the Industrial Revolution. Richard Arkwright invented the water frame, one of the key inventions of the key innovations of the British Industrial Revolution. So if they really made their wealth, or you can argue they made it, we today tend to consider the situation more legitimate. And that's what we see, however, this was kind of the opposite in the Middle Ages. And from entrepreneurship, I disentangle finance, because finance has always been seen in the Western tradition, and this from the classical antiquity, but big time there's a certain distaste and reprobation of finance developed during the Middle Ages, right? Also as part of the reflections by theologians. And so the point is, finance has always been seen as a suspicious way to make money, and this stigma has weakened in time, but also has remained there, again, from the Middle Ages until today. And we see it resurfacing regularly with, for example, the Occupy Wall Street movement. Next slide, please. Now, the point is the following. In the early Middle Ages, but as late as the, say, 12th century or even the 13th century, finance was really considered an issue. So it was considered to be against the prescriptions of the Christian religion, right? And the point is, by the 14th century, it was clear that certain practices had become legitimate, so they could be done legally. But then the problem becomes that the stigma remains there. And to make an example, consider this guy here, Francesco Di Marco d'Attini, who is a very interesting person because of his personal experience. So he was made an orphan by the Black Death in the 14th century. So he inherits something, he sells everything, then raises some capital, moves to Avignon in France, and starts trading between Avignon in France and Prato, his original town in Tuscany, in Italy, but very soon he becomes a very successful merchant, and he moves back to Tuscany. He opens branches branches of his companies around Europe and the Mediterranean, and he becomes one of the main merchants of the 14th century across Europe, right? And then when he was already pretty old, by the end of the 14th century, he decides that he also wants to open a bank. And then he asks his friends, and business associates what they think about this, and those who answer tell him, but why do you want to do it? You are already very rich. You have a very good name as a merchant. You are a very important person in Florence. Why do you want to become a money changer, right? So why do you want to open a bank? Because you will ruin your name, as everybody will say this guy has become a usurer, because all those who lend money in the end are usurers, right? And that's the point. He didn't want to do anything against the law, but he wanted to do something which was still considered, generally speaking, highly suspicious and potentially sinful. Now, one reason why I focus on the West is that, as I argue in the book, there are some features of how the rich have been considered in the Western tradition, which are closely connected to the Christian religion, right? In particular to medieval theology. The reprobation of finance is one such feature, but more generally, as we will see, the point is that for medieval theologians, the rich were intrinsically sinners, and their sin one was avarice. Next slide, please. But before getting there, let's consider another tradition which has to do with the role placed in particular by the super rich in society, looking in particular at the role in politics. Now, I will read you these two texts which refer to two very different periods. So text number 1, the super rich are so unequal and exceed and overcome the others regarding political power so much, it is reasonable to think that they are among the others as God is among men. And I take the title of my book from here with a paraphrasis. The cities which are governed democratically should relegate these people. They should send them in exile or banish them, as such cities try and pursue equality of all. Gassan, change slide, please. Second slide. People with inherited wealth need save only a portion of their income from capital to see that capital grow more quickly in the economy as a whole. Under such conditions, the concentration of capital will attain extremely high levels, potentially incompatible with the meritocratic values and principles of social justice fundamental to modern democratic societies. So the point is, both these people are talking about democracies, right? And they're talking about the role of the super rich in a democracy. And they say, if you have super rich in a democracy, if you have excessive wealth inequality, then you can't expect that a democracy will function as it is supposed to function. Next slide. Maybe you recognize the Piketty as the second author, but the first author is Nicolas Oresme, who is a medieval theologian and, well, not a theologian, he's a medieval political thinker, who is translating in the 14th century Aristotle politics. So he's translating a text from classical antiquity, and already Aristotle was arguing that if you have a democracy, that you have somebody who is, again, who has too much virtue compared to others, and one of these virtue might be wealth, but he also thinking about other things, then you have a problem, right? Because the democracy then will not function as it is supposed to function. What is clear in the translations and comments on Aristotle in the Middle Ages is that people like Oresme instead were looking in particular at wealth. So for them, wealth was the problem if you wanted to have a democracy. And he was thinking about the city-states, the very small republics which existed in different parts of Europe in that period, and surely in Central Northern Italy, but also, for example, in the Low Countries, so nowadays Belgium and the Netherlands. So the point is the question about whether having extreme concentration of wealth is compatible with a democracy has been part of Western political thought, in this case from classical antiquity, and then very clearly from the Middle Ages until today. And this is also something that is typical, again, of the Western tradition. Next slide. But to go back more generally at the role played by the rich in society, I was telling you before that for medieval theologians, wealthy commoners were all sinners. And now one thing which has to be highlighted is that wealthy commoners were sinners, but not the nobles, because the nobles, arguably, as they argued actually, had their greater access to economic resources because of the role they played in society. So their wealth corresponded to God's plan, how a godly society had to be organized, and they had that wealth because they had a kind of relationship with their subjects. So it was a a relationship of mutual help and support, if you want. But the commoners weren't supposed to become very wealthy. And if they did, why they were accumulating wealth, which they could have used to help the poor, as required for medieval theologians by the gospel, basically. And then, if they became wealthy, they were automatically sinners, and their sin was avarice, which was considered one of the worst possible sins. And in fact, Thomas Aquinas, which is really an exemplary theologian from this period, argued that rulers of cities should have tried and prevent their subjects from becoming involved in international trade, otherwise they would have become too wealthy. And this was not good, because this would have had a corrupting influence on society, a morally corrupting influence on society. Now, the fact is, however, that Thomas Aquinas was condemning something which he was seeing happening. All these theologians were thinking about wealth and the wealthy and the rich, because they were seeing people becoming much wealthier than in previous epochs. And why is that? Because with the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, so from the 12th century, the 11th and 12th century, with the reopening of long-range trade across the Mediterranean, then across the Baltic, and then later connecting different parts of this broader economic area, there were opportunities to become much wealthier than before. And these people were looking at this social change, and they didn't like it, and they were doing what they could to stop it, and they couldn't, which is why, get some change slide, please, which is why by the end of the Middle Ages, the rich had to be found a place in society, because you couldn't simply dismiss them all as sinners. And what was the role found for the rich to play in Western culture from the end of the Middle Ages? Well, one was what an Italian humanist, Poggio Bracciolini, in a treatise on avarice, argues at the beginning of the 15th century. Says, well, if you have many rich people in your city, they will basically be private barns of money, in which the community can tap in time of crisis. Because if you have a crisis, get some change slide. If you have a crisis, will you ask for help to the poor, who don't have anything to give you, because what you need is not work, what you need is money, right? Or to the rich, to the wealthy, who will have the resources to help you. Now, here, when I say that the community can tap in the private resources of the rich, I'm not saying that the rich, the wealthy, are necessarily happy to help, right? The point is, the wealth is there. We can ask them to help us, for example, by providing a loan to the state. If they aren't ready to do it, we can force them to provide a loan, or we can tax them, or we can expropriate them. So the idea was, willing or not, they'll be there to help us, right? It's not a matter that they also need to be happy to do it. The point is, without them, we will be unable to have the resources we need. Second slide, please. And then there was a second role found to the rich, which in this case, again, kind of connects to a tradition of the classical antiquity, which is magnificence. And magnificence literally means doing great deeds. And another humanist, again, as an example, humanist from Italy, Giovanni Pontano, at the end of the 15th century says, in our age, Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo the Elder, was the first to renew the ancient tradition of magnificence. And what does this mean? It means changing his private wealth into public benefit. And why, in the end, why would the rich do this? And the point is, even if a very wealthy family simply builds a palace for their own private use in a city, even if you, as a normal person, aren't allowed in the palace, you can still see it in your city and admire it, right? The city becomes more beautiful. And all the people who will come from outside will see all these palaces, and they will think better of your city and also of you. And in the end, if you think about the main touristic attractions in Italy, like places like Venice or Florence, it's true that we can go there and enjoy the private villas and palaces of people who build them for their personal use and to show off one versus the other many centuries ago. Even better, if the rich, instead of building their own palaces, establish some institutions, like, for example, they could found monasteries or establish public libraries. Change slide, please, Gassan. And in fact, if we think about Cosimo di Medici, he did exactly this, right? We still have the buildings he established. He established what is the Medici Library, which is supposed to have been the first public library of Renaissance Europe. He established many religious institutions, including charities. So really was magnificent. And let me tell you a little bit more about this case. Change slide. Because Cosimo de' Medici is an excellent example because he performed both functions assigned to the rich, to the wealthy in the 15th century. Now, in 1433, he was exiled by Florence, being accused of intending to rise above the other citizens. And as Florence was a republic, this wasn't acceptable, right? And his political enemies actually tried to have him executed. They don't dare in the end, that they end up simply exiling him. Florence was a republic. Problem is, they exile Cosimo de' Medici, but then for entirely different reasons, they go to war with Siena over the control of the city of Lucca, all these small city-states in the Tuscan area. And they lose the war. So the country paid the war debt with the spoils of war, and the city risks to go bankrupt on its debt. So what to do? Well, in 1434, they decide to call Cosimo back. They exile his political enemies and call him back. And he tells his bank, okay, we will cover the debt of the city. He saves the city, is hailed as the savior and the benefactor of the country, basically. And from that year, he also intensifies his magnificence. So is when he really starts building for the public benefit. But the problem is that 1434 is also the date that historians indicate as the beginning of the so-called hidden seigneury of the Medici family in Florence. Technically, Florence remains a republic, but it's dominated politically by the Medici, and the descendants of Cosimo will actually become dukes of Florence and then dukes of Tuscany. And the problem is the following. It was clear to everybody in Florence back then, as it was clear in the classical world, that magnificence, so doing great deeds, was not munificence, which means making gifts. So magnificence has a political content. It's also a claim to rule, right? And this is interesting because there is a debate today about how we should consider things that we call philanthropy or giving. And the idea in philanthropy is a concept from the 18th century, basically. And the idea is that real philanthropy doesn't require anything in exchange. So, it's a gift. If you get in exchange even simple influence, that's not real philanthropy. And then the problem becomes, from my point of view, whether in the West we are maybe calling something philanthropy and giving, which is in fact closer to magnificence, right? So, an explicit attempt to build up influence, in particular, political influence. Next slide, please. Now, to make a long story short, if we think about the main role given to the rich, so help the communities in times of crisis, this role continues to be played by the rich across the ages. We have very clear examples during the world wars when, again, the rich were heavily required to pay for the cost of war. If we think more specifically to a super rich saving the community from a major crisis, in particular a financial crisis, the last example I could make is a little bit earlier, and that's JP Morgan in 1907. So basically, what happens is that there is a bank crisis in 1907, United States, and faced with the threat of, right after the weekend, having a run on the banks, so people going to the banks to retrieve all their money, JP Morgan convenes in his private library in New York, which, by the way, today is a museum, so magnificence. He convenes a group of financiers from New York. He locks them in the room, and he tells them, "You are not getting out until we find a solution." And they find a solution. They're able to restore faith in the solvability of the financial system of America using their personal, financial, and relational resources. And after this, JP Morgan is applauded with words very similar to those used by the Florentines to welcome back Cosimo de' Medici when he came back in 1434 to save his city. But what's the problem here? At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States are a modern democracy. And then this display of financial and economic power becomes very suspicious because there was already a suspicion towards a small group of super rich individuals, a specific component of a wealth aristocracy, in fact, in the US of that period. And this small group, called usually the money trust, was supposed to be already controlling the economy and the finances of the United States, and it was feared that they might have wanted to control also the politics of the country. And this was a bipartisan consent. It wasn't like a leftish or right-wing view. This was a bipartisan concern. And that's because of this display of economic power that a few years after the Peugeot Committee is established by the US Senate to investigate the money trust. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System is set up to avoid the United States ever having again to ask to a private financier to save them. And the point is, that's the beginning of a real fight against this high concentration of wealth at the very top, which also goes through a strengthening in antitrust and in the application, in particular, of antitrust legislation. It also connects to the intensification of taxation, in particular, very progressive taxation focused on the patrimonies of the richest individuals, right? So all this serves also a political objective, which is avoiding that a small group of super rich people take over the politics of the country. Exactly the kind of concern which we see from Aristotle to Horace and then until today. Next slide, please. Now, trying to conclude, if we think about the role played by the rich more generally today in Western countries, here you have a graph with the wealth share of the rich as 1% and 0.1% in a sample of countries from 1900 to 2020. The two red bars mark the beginning of the two major economic crises. So in 1929, the stock market crash of Wall Street, which triggers the Great Depression, and in 2007, the financial crisis, which then triggers the Great Recession. But as you see, the wealth share of the rich declines big time after the first crisis, but not after the second. So one way of presenting this is saying, okay, the patrimony of the richest has become exceptionally resilient against crisis. So, what's the problem? Good for them. Surely it's good for them, but this also can be read in a different way. Got some change slide? And the point is the following. If we look at the surveys of fiscal reform in OECD countries that we have, we find that after all the recent crises, so after the Great Recession, 2008, the sovereign debt crisis in some countries of Europe, COVID-19, and then the current needs of the war involving Russia and Ukraine. So the point is, not one of these crises led to an increase in taxation, even temporary, even for a specific objective of the most affluent. And this wasn't because there wasn't a request from the bottom to do this, because we find in all Western countries, we find that in all these crises, surely during COVID, but also during the Great Recession, there were requests from the bottom, from society as a whole, to make the most affluent contribute more to pay the bill of the crisis. But this didn't happen. And so what's the problem? The fact that there is this request suggests that there is still an expectation which has been enrooted which has become enrooted in Western culture from the end of the Middle Ages and continued to exist till today, of thinking that the rich should contribute more during the crisis, but the rich haven't been made to fulfill their traditional role, right? And then the problem becomes, if they are fulfilling the role given to them at the end of the Middle Ages to actually find them a position to play in society, if they aren't doing it, then the role they actually play in society becomes again unclear, and this might fuel resentment towards them, instability, especially if the tendency for wealth and equality to grow will continue. I'm sorry I've been a little bit quick, also because of the problems we had. Ghassan, you can move to the next 2 slides and then we will stop there. Okay, thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Professor Alfani, for giving us this overview of your book. I think, yeah, you managed to cover a lot in a short period of time. So I think that was a great introduction, really. As I said, we now have still have some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out for Professor Alfani to respond to. Maybe I can start us off with a question that sort of came to mind when I was sort of listening now to your talk. I think you talk a lot about sort of finding the right role for the rich in society. And you talk about, the church sort of becomes involved in trying to situate the rich somehow in society and giving them a role. But I wonder whether you can talk a bit more about what the rich themselves did to sort of shape what role was given to them in society. I mean, certainly today I can think of examples where the rich kind of try to. I mean, they certainly have a lot of power to influence social sort of views of them, of course, and so I would think that in history that was probably the case as well. So I'm thinking, to what extent did they play themselves a role in shaping, the role that society gave them?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So the role found to the rich for the rich to play at the end of the Middle Ages is not found by the church, but by lay people, right? Lay scholars and writers of the time. And many of them actually were also benefiting from the patronage of super rich individuals of the time. So the point is they were also like, speaking well about their patrons, if you want. And then the question becomes, to which degree these patrons were actually trying to improve the social perception of themselves. To some degree, they were doing it. Now, there is also another side of the story. People like Cosimo de' Medici, so in the 15th century, actually believed that they were sinners. They had this suspicion. They cared about their immortal soul, right? To the point that Cosimo, even in his old life, buys a ball of absolution directly from the Pope. And maybe got a discount because he was also the banker of the Pope, right? So that's a bizarre context. But the point is, why to do it if you aren't worried about what you did? So he thought that maybe some of his business activities, he was a banker, right? So this again. Perception of finance as something which is problematic and potentially sinful was still there very much. So he was worried about this. In the 15th century, especially towards the end of the 15th century, then more clearly in the 16th century, however, we start seeing in the Western tradition, written tradition, that the merchants, for example, start presenting themselves as virtuous individuals, and then they develop a discourse about the good ethics of the perfect merchant, who needs to be like a good person, to have a high moral standing, not to gamble, to be trustworthy, and blah blah blah. And on this tendency, at some point, also the Protestant Reformation intervenes. It's not the beginning of the change, right? Because it begins later. But the Protestant Reformation actually makes of the pursuit of success in life the proof of being favored by God, right? So it makes the pursuit of material success a kind of religious activity. This is what Max Weber argued for. And the point is, in my perspective, which is kind of more long run, this only strengthens a tendency which had been ongoing for a long time, right? And then this continues. And the fact that the very rich people consider themselves virtuous, while not necessarily being considered virtuous by the rest of society, is something we can observe to some degree to this day. Although today, I would say that Western societies are exceptionally looking in an exceptionally favorable way to the super rich, who are regarded like as like superheroes sometimes, even like model figures.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any questions? I hope that we'll get a few, particularly including from our graduate students. So that would be good. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I'll be happy to read them out. If we don't for now, I mean, I have many more questions, so I'll ask another question, and I suppose. Particularly given that we are I think a lot of people in the audience, including myself, we work on China. And so the question immediately comes up, I feel, because you say you're sort of thinking or your decision to focus on the West also had to do with the critical role of Christianity in how, how the rich are seen and how the rich sort of developed. But I wonder, I mean, I'm sure you must have thought about that a bit more, how that compares to other regions of the world. It doesn't have to be China necessarily, but I'm thinking whether you at all contrast this ever with other regions of the world, and whether you can talk also a bit more about the role of Christianity in views of the rich in the West, and what that might, I mean, what might have been unique about that if compared to other regions of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an excellent question. So the other reason for me to focus on the West is that, well, first I decided to write a social science book about the rich because I realized that this had never been done, right? So it's kind of new. And for many topics, I was actually exploring with a new, at least at the very least, exploring a topic with a very different angle compared to what had been done in the past, right? So the point is, I wasn't tapping into a pre-existing literature for the West, right? I had really to use a literature on different topics for a little bit different purposes. And then if I had wanted to make this comparative, I would have faced the obstacle that also for these other areas, we don't have that kind of literature as far as I know. And of course, I don't have access to non-Western languages, right? I can read many different European languages, but I can't read Chinese or Japanese or Arabic. Then there are things which I know are kind of common. For example, the reprobation of finance and of lending for an interest is something which is entirely shared by the Muslim tradition. So from that point of view, the problem was similar. And there are studies which suggest how different ways of managing the same problem were found, right? Because the point was also that even the states needed money, and how do you get it? It was not only a matter of how private individuals can get access to credit. It was also how a state can get access to credit. That in Europe, in the Christian area, was one important reason why rulers weren't so happy to comply with everything that the church would have liked, right? They weren't, because they knew that somebody had to be able to lend them for money. And I think I can safely say that more generally, there has been a suspicion of those making money out of money. And I think this is possibly something that can be found in different ways also in other world areas. Regarding other aspects, if I have to consider that even just focusing on one thing, which is like one of the premises of my book, which is the exploration of how much wealth is concentrated across the ages, right? So if I look at this, there are now some early studies of wealth concentration in Japan that go back to the very end of the Middle Ages, or in certain periods of China, but we haven't nearly the same kind of estimates that have been produced in the last 15 years for Europe. So the point is really, for me, having to rely only on the literature available in English or some other European language, it will be very, very difficult. So I think that there is something that probably is typical of the West, maybe regarding the social position of the rich in society. I'm also pretty sure that as the problems were kind of similar, they have to be tackled in other world areas. So I think that here there is an excellent opportunity for doing some comparative research, and they will be the first to be super interested in reading a history of the rich in China, for example, or in Japan, or in any other non-Western part of the world. And hopefully one day we will have enough knowledge to go global, to actually be able to write a global history of the rich, which we can't really do, but not even for today in the end. I mean, maybe for today we could try and do it, but I think that would be very interesting, but also I think that this has never been done, right? We have some comparative metrics, but the question of the social position of the rich in different areas of the world, right, in a comparative way, I don't think this has ever been explored. It might be much more easily than, of course, the Middle Ages of the early modern period, but it has never been done. That's also something that the students who are listening to us might consider, because it's potentially very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think so. I've also not come across anything comparative, and I think there would be potentially a lot of interesting sort of results that we can gauge from that for sure. We do have a question which is very broad, but it's asking for recommendations, but I'm going to read it out anyways. So that comes from Daniel Ho, and the question is, or he says, "Thank you very much for your presentation. If I want to know more about the economic history of Europe, could you recommend some books to me? Thank you." That's a very broad question, but I don't know whether there's anything you could think of.
Right. Of course, I can recommend my own book, but jokes apart, that depends a bit on the time period, right? And the point is, if it is the wall of the economic history of Europe, then I would say that there are some textbooks of varying quality. I mean, if you want a comparative book, I would actually recommend the now relatively old book by Pomeranz, The Great Divergence, which is really a nice attempt, not easily imitated, I would say, to try and address certain questions having a global perspective. If you're interested in, say, capitalism as it developed in Europe, I can also recommend a very recent book by Jan-Leuten van Zanden and Martin Praag, which is called The Pioneers of Capitalism, basically. And that's a short book, but a very nice one. And then, again, depending on the topic, feel free to send me an email and ask, maybe specifying the period you are more interested in, and I will give you a more specific feedback.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Shushijin, and the question is, thank you for sharing. Could you please talk more about the short-term and long-term impact of the Medici family's power-grabbing actions with their vast wealth on democracy?
Mm-hmm. So the point is, the beginning of after Cosimo de' Medici arguably grabs the power in Florence, things had to go downhill from there, right? So the point is, Cosimo was trying to rule without appearing to rule. He was, maybe mindful of the threat of violence that you always had in that kind of society. So the point is, you don't want to be killed by your fellow citizens, right? If they decide you are a tyrant or whatever. His descendants continue to control the politics of Florence by basically controlling the people who got elected to different positions. Then at some point there is basically an attempt to overthrow the rule of the Medici in Florence, which is the famous coup tried by the Pazzi family when they, at the time of Lawrence the Magnificent, right? And the point is they kill his brother, he escapes, and then these people, this faction in Florence tries to create a public revolt against the Medici, but they fail in doing it. The population remains with the Medici, right? And then they are expelled, and that's also the moment when the Medici family takes the excuse of this failed coup to actually change the institutions, and that's when the Republican institutions really are emptied of meaning. In future generations, you have that the Medici themselves are enfeoffed of Florence, so that becomes they become nobles formally, and that's become their fief, right? First Dukes of Florence, then Dukes of Tuscany, and then Grand Dukes of Tuscany, and they rule till the extinction of the dynasty, with a very short period of leave, if you want, at the end of the 15th century, when for a very short time the Republic is re-established. But that's because Piero de' Medici makes something that the Florentines really dislike, and then in the end, however, the family comes back. So it has long-term consequences. There is no, I mean, in that case, there is no way back. The path is clear.
Yeah, thank you. We're already running out of time. Sorry?
Not very encouraging, I don't understand.
Yeah, we're already running out of time, but maybe we have time for one final question. And that question comes from Lee Lin. Many thanks for your amazing talk. I'm wondering if you would like to say more about the differences between entrepreneurship and business in their path to affluence in Western history. Well, it's kind of depends how you define it. But yeah, I don't know whether.
Right. Well, I use these words as synonym in the book. I tend to use more entrepreneurship as a word. If you want to talk about possible differences, I could refer to the kind of distinction that people like Thorstein Veblen do at the beginning of the 20th century. So he distinguishes industry and business, basically. When by industry, it basically means entrepreneurship. And by business, it means, the kind of economic activity which doesn't have to do with establishing a new enterprise or creating something, but simply controlling companies by means of financial control, right? And he argues that then entrepreneurs, those in industry, and businessmen have a very different mindset, right? And they argue, on the one side, you have people who actually build. They have also a moral attitude and a culture which leads them to create something new and also create something which then allows others to profit from it because, for example, they can get a job, from people who are simply interested in exploiting the situation and maximizing their potential revenue from their assets. And by the way, the example he makes of this category, among the examples he makes, there is also JP Morgan. He really disliked Thorstein Veblen, the Morgan family. And he presents this other category of people, so the businessmen in this meaning, as modern predators, if you want. They are like trying to exploit the situation and predate on what others have built. And of course, the does this distinction with a very strong moral judgment. But that's maybe the only point in the book in which I, presenting his views, actually, I discuss this kind of issue. And by the way, this is also a kind of debate in which you see again this bias, this negative perception of finance, right? Because this control of companies is through finance, basically.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm afraid we have already run out of time. As usual, yeah, time runs out too quickly. But what remains for me to do, Professor Alfani, is to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, and of course to everyone for tuning in and listening patiently. And also, yeah, again, Professor Alfani, thank you for responding to all the questions so patiently. Yeah, so thank you very much, and I think we're all, you know, everyone should now get a copy of the book and actually read the book after this great introduction that we've gotten
Thank you.
from
It
you.
has really been a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm sorry for the technical issues which were beyond my control. I don't know why this happened.
No problem. It happens. It happens. Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Alfani, and thank you very much to all the attendees. So thank you very much, and see you all soon.
Thanks again. Bye.
All right. Bye bye.